Welcome to the 3-Rule Parenting Podcast, where we have conversations about parenting with grace and how to better disciple our own children. I'm Pastor Melissa. I'm the lead pastor here at First United Methodist Church of Cleveland, and I'm a mom to a 20-month-year-old daughter named Ellis, and she is only 20-month-year-old.
20-month-year-old.
Yeah,
whatever,
it works.
Yeah.
Technically, it's a weird way to put it.
It is.
For 2 more days, though. For only 2 more days, will she be 20 months.
My name is Reverend Bill Malden, and I'm one of the associate pastors here at the church, and I work with family ministry, so I work with children and students and their parents, and I have 2 kids in high school. I have a son and a daughter, both high school kids.
And I am Reverend Kevin Anderson, and I'm the pastor of community here, and I have 2 kids, a son who is in high school, and then a daughter who has just started junior high.
Oof.
Oh my
I know.
Goodness, I love it so much.
Yeah.
And we are on episode 4 already of 3-Rule Parenting. If you haven't listened to the first 3 episodes, highly recommend you do that because go back, listen to them because they lay out what 3-Rule Parenting is, which is using John Wesley's 3 general rules: do no harm, do good, stay in love with God, as a framework for how we can talk about grace and having conversations with our kids, but also how we are active disciples in discipling our kids and teaching them to be disciples. And so we thought, why not make episode 4 about, let's talk about sin. Why not? We did that really well, y'all. I'm proud of us. So today we're going to this is kind of like a 2-part episode. Really, we're doing some like heavy theological work today so that we can better get into a discussion on parenting in it. So we want to do some like heavy lifting on theological terms when it comes to sin, because I think a lot of times when we think about sin, it's such a big category. And a great resource on this is actually the Bible Project. If you actually Google Bible Project bad words, they've got this great bad words, but it's all on sin. It's not what it is. It's all on sin. But there's actually 3 great categories of sin that they talk about. And so we're going to talk about those today. And the first is actually the word that we think of, which is the most commonly used throughout Scripture, which is sin, which is translated as kata, or in Greek it's hamarti, which is literally to fail or to miss the goal. In Latin, it's actually an archer's term. Yeah. It's literally to miss the mark. It's about a failure to love God. And so it's about breaking the greatest commandment, right? And it's something the Jewish people understood deeply, right? Because it comes out of the Shema, which we get in Deuteronomy 6. I think when we get into the New Testament, when Jesus comes around, we so many times think that Jesus is the one that gave us the greatest commandment. Well, yeah, but what Jesus is actually referencing, which I appreciate so much in Luke's gospel account of the greatest commandment, is because Jesus puts it back on that teacher of the law. This teacher of the law is trying to prove himself and is like, hey, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus is like, how do you read it? And the teacher of the law simply quotes the Shema, which is Deuteronomy 6, and that's what the teacher of the law quotes is love God with everything you got and love your neighbor as yourself. So sin then is a failure to love God and a failure to see and recognize what we call the imago Dei, or the image of God in someone else.
And I think we struggle, that second part of it, I think is what we struggle with the most, is seeing the image of God in others.
Right.
And that's sometimes hard to do when, we're human and make mistakes.
That's what I was going to say.
We're human and we mess up. And so when we see somebody else mess up, I think we see more of their sin sometimes than we do who they are.
So there's a part I like in here that we're talking about the humanity aspect of this. I saw a meme. I was trying to find the actual quote before we started, and so I'm going to have to paraphrase rather than quote, which I hate doing.
We'll forget
but
you.
Yeah, it was a rabbi's quote, but it was basically something to the fact that in the Jewish tradition that sin was kind of failing to live up to our potential and our humanity.
Yeah.
But it made me think of, in some of the translations within the Bible, they call Jesus the human one.
Yes.
And so I like that idea of
John's
Jesus,
gospel.
Jesus being the fullest expression of what human potential looks like. And so that then when we strive to be like Jesus and we come up short, which we do because we're not perfect as he was, then if Jesus and his teaching and example are our goal, our bullseye, if we will. Anything short of that, which is still just being human, you can still be being quite good, but short of being the perfection that's Jesus, we would call that sin. But this is one of those things that I like that we're bringing up this topic, is that you have kind of this idea that all evil is sin, but not all sin is evil.
Exactly.
And I think we use these words interchangeably too often within the church.
Which we have to be careful
And that's one of the reasons we're wanting to bring up this conversation.
Which,
is that not sin and evil is not exactly quite the same thing.
And I think it's also a great acknowledgement, again, going back to the archery image of thinking of a bullseye of you can hit in the black, the yellow, or the red, right? And so there's decent, there's good, there's better, and there's best. And I remember there was a time where I got involved in this storytelling collective, and there was actually this storyteller who actually began his storytelling with kind of an invitation of understanding why he was telling the story he was telling in the way that he told it, which was actually he told his story, and the story was that he actually failed. And then he said, he ended his story by saying, so I want to retell the story, but I want to tell it as though he had hit the bullseye. And so the invitation and the challenge for him wasn't to paint over with rose-colored glasses as though he had done the right thing, but instead to capture his imagination so that if an instance of this happened again in his future, because most likely it would, or some similar situation, that his imagination would be captured in such a way that he would act in such a way that he wanted to act. He was visualizing how he wants to act in the future when the situation occurs. And I think that's the beauty of what Jesus does when he tells us parables. He's telling us how what do we want to be? Do we want to be the harvest that produces 100 times fold?
What does hitting the mark look like?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so I think sometimes the way that we talk to ourselves, if we only talk about ourselves as we constantly are sin, failure, then our only imagination is when we fail people or fail God.
Well, and this idea of missing the mark as our understanding what sin is for me as part of the Wesleyan tradition makes me think of that question we all got asked at our ordinations. Are you going on to perfection? Which I always enjoy. That everyone kind of giggles when they say yes. But this is the idea Wesley was pushing.
Can we actually believe that?
But Wesley, Christ says, be perfect as I am perfect. So there's this thing of we do know what perfection in humanity looks like. We have that in Jesus. And so we know what we should be striving for. And again, yes, you aim for the bullseye. So if you miss it a little bit, so what? You still, that's what you're striving for, and you know what your goal is. And so I think that's one of those things where it shifts this idea of what it means to just miss the mark, and especially if Jesus is the mark, it changes, I think, the mindset when we talk about what does it mean to sin or to even admit and confess, I am a sinner. I am less than the perfection of Jesus.
Which that's
it's not as heavy as normally you hear that, you sinner, and you're
you're terrible.
Hey, you're not as perfect as Jesus. Are you okay with that? Yeah, I'm good.
I'm fine.
Which is honestly,
but I'm working on it. But I am striving for perfection.
And that's actually what Paul is trying to get at. He talks about, and he often compares it, and it's using the Greek word hamarti. There it is. Woo! There we go. Hamarti.
Sometimes it sounds like a cheese.
It does. Hamarti. Anyways, Paul is actually very playful with this word in the sense of the wages of sin is death, and this idea that we're slaves to sin and we can be consumed by it, that there is this it can devour us like a wild animal. This language is so pervasive and so metaphoric and capturing of our imagination. And Paul really does a great job of that, and so do the prophets. We see it throughout the Old Testament as well. But Paul is also great at flipping it, and that's why you see so many times, and why I actually get really frustrated when other translations just make it, I'm a servant of Christ. No, it's meant to be, I'm a slave of Christ. I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. He's playing off of, I'm no longer a slave to sin, that's so all consuming, but instead
Slave
I'm going to be a
Christ.
slave of Christ. I'm going to let Christ consume me, because again, it's that, just like that guy in the storytelling world was visualizing a different thing to consume, instead of sin, Paul is doing the same thing of, I'm going to become the slave to Christ. And I love that. So that's the biggest one. That's the one that we hear the most of, but there's also two other types of quote unquote sin that get talked about quite a lot. And the next one is most often translated transgression, which is pesha. And it's often translated as actually a verb throughout the scriptures. And that's actually this like breaking of a trust.
Right.
So transgression is like when you break that trust. So it's when you violate a treaty, it is this, it's treachery. And there's this, you pasha against someone. And so when you go out, and it's even, when you make war or when you break a treaty, you're pashawing against one another. And even if the other person or the other community, society acts first, even if you are engaging back, both communities are in pasha, in transgression, because both have broken.
Yeah, so you have transgress, but I think it also ties to the word with like trespass. When we think about, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Again, you could translate our sins, but you could also then break it down to what does that word mean. And forgive us those times when we've broken trust. With others, as we have broken trust. With others. Help us to forgive those who have broken our trust, just as we acknowledge that we have broken trust with others, and we've broken trust with God. And so there's that. Again, when we use words that we are too removed from, they start to have a different meaning than I think what they're intended to mean. So I like that we're kind of coming back to these roots of what these words mean. We say that prayer, forgive us our trespasses. What does that mean to anybody? But when you say, forgive us for those times when we break trust, you're like, I totally understand that.
That's a little different.
Yeah, that's real.
Yeah.
Whereas
it's simpler, I think,
it is,
to say let trust is something that I've broken, has been broken against me, and it's very easy maybe to gain trust. It's very hard to get that trust back. And so when we're saying that term trespass, I do like using the word trust because it gives it more weight, but it's also simpler at the same time. It's like, okay, trespass, when you think trespass, it's like, well, somebody walked into my backyard without my permission. That's, a criminal, maybe, when you think about that. When you say trust, it's like, okay, that's more relatable.
Right. For someone who's such an extrovert, like, come on into my backyard. I don't care. Like, oh, you're here. Like, there was an evening at the church where I left people at my house, and I thought they'd be gone by the time I got back, and instead they had raided my fridge and were having an impromptu dinner.
Having coffee. Would you like a cup?
Yeah, they were. Well, no, they had opened the bottle of wine while I was gone. I was like, pour me a glass. Like, it was one of those things where it's for other people, but instead when someone crosses like a personal, like breaking that trust with me, that that stings, that hurts.
Well, and for us as parents, but also as disciples, that I think it's helpful to have this conversation about trust. So as parents, when I think about this idea, I think about this balance between freedom and responsibility. And again, your kids are always wanting more freedom, and you're like, okay, but can you carry the equal responsibility? And that's that trust factor. Can I trust that you can be responsible with that freedom? And so we think about that in our parenting. Are we raising our children to be trustworthy, worthy of that trust? Can you handle this much freedom? And we have to give them freedom, but do that in a balance. But then when we stop and think about God viewing us as that children, God is trying to give us this freedom, but with that freedom that God has granted us comes a responsibility. And are we being worthy of God's trust for all the freedoms that God has given us? And I think that too shifts this idea of what does it mean if I say that I have sinned or that I am a sinner, to say maybe I'm not living up to my responsibilities. For all the freedom that God has granted me, I'm not carrying my weight. And again, that shifts that word for me. Okay, it doesn't mean I'm evil. It means, maybe I'm not carrying my weight.
And what a great little Wesleyan plug in there of free will. Just, I wanted to call it out.
Gotta love it.
Okay, so sin, is this idea of moving from what could be all the way out to evil, right?
Right.
It can, but not all things are evil that are sin. But moving in from like the okay decision to the good decision to the best, most in line with Christ's
Right.
decision, right?
Almost Christ-like.
Almost
Almost.
Christ-like, right? Perfection, striving towards
Striving.
perfection. And then transgression is when we break that trust. And so the balm to transgression is reconciliation, right? It's the healing.
I love that you said that. So again, normally when we talk about sin, it's like, what do we do with sin? Well, we fight sin.
Right.
We crush sin. And you're like, but the response here, if you shift the understanding of sin, is the answer to sin is not fight and war. That's more sin. That's more division. It's reconciliation.
Right, because to move into a fight, right, would be to pesha in this case.
It's more sin.
It's more sin, yeah. Which brings us to the third and final category of sin that we'll talk about that is the most common that we encounter in Scripture, which is iniquity, is how it's often, which is avon or ava would be the biblical terminology in there. And what that is it's behavior that is crooked. It literally means like bent or crooked. So it's also used to describe like roads that curve and bend, right? Or even like when the woman has the bent over back in the New Testament, her back is avon, it's ava, it's bent, it's wickedness is another word that can be substituted within this. So it's bent out of shape, but it also has this sense of being distorted. So you're not seeing things in the proper alignment. And so, again, especially within the Hebraic culture, they love the play on these things, right? So it's not saying that the woman was wicked, right? Like that's why her back isn't bent. Her physical being was bent. But in the Old Testament, when the prophets are speaking out against, Judah or Israel for like, man, like you have forgotten the poor, you are neglecting the immigrant that has come into your lands. And the way that they describe the rulers is that they have become bent, and they're not actually bent over, but their actions have become distorted and they're bent. So that's iniquity. And in that, there's this idea of cycles of retaliation that come in the midst of it. So really, you're getting into issues of injustice. And I think it also brings up a really great importance of when we talk about sin, there's an importance to talk about when we're talking about sin in this broader category. Sin can be something that happens on a personal level. And it's important for us to deal with that and talk about that and understand that for ourselves and as parents to understand that for our kids. But there's also sin that happens on a corporate level, which can be on our society and our culture, systemic, right? All of these kinds of things. And so it's cycles and systems that get put into place. And so one of the big things that the prophets are about, that Jesus is about breaking these kinds of cycles that happen. And that is really big and scary work. I also love that one of the things that kind of gets translated in the midst of this is like God will allow someone to carry their avon. God will allow you. And again, I think this goes back to the free will discussion of like, God didn't cause the avon to happen. Like you did the avon, you did the iniquity, like you bent, you distorted. But it's kind of like, to put it in Southern terms, you made the bed, now you got to lay in it, right? You got to suffer. You got to experience the consequences of your own.
You got to carry it with you.
Yeah.
I love that that's one of the things that, they talk about is the way God punishes that kind of sin is just letting you stay in it.
Yes.
That, okay, that's the world you're going to create. Well, then I'll let you have it. It's an interesting idea that God's punishment is, okay, I'll let you have what you just created. I'll let you go down the road that you've chosen.
Yes.
That we have, again, when we think about these things, there's always so negative to think about God's punishment, and it's, outside coming down, but that the idea of punishment is just allowing you to experience your own bad choices.
Yes.
That is the punishment of God, is just allowing you to do that, again, that crooked thing, because you're hurting yourself. I think it's one of those things when we have that bent worldview, when our way of thinking is bent, not only are we going to hurt others around us, but that's going to come back to hurt ourselves. We're only going to punish
Right.
ourselves
and
as well.
And as parents, we talked about this previously, that sometimes, and it's hard for us to say, I'm going to let my child make that bad decision so that they can learn from it. Well, God, as parent, allows us to make a bad decision, and then hopefully we can learn from it. And as parents, I like that analogy to say, okay, but it's difficult. I don't want to say, like, you know what, Carson, that's a terrible decision.
Sorry, Carson.
Sorry, I'm not going to let
you. That it's we're going to save Kevin in this. So,
it's fine.
Well, but I like that idea, and I think one of the things that, again, we talk about the use of words and the importance of words. I think a lot of people struggle with the idea of punishment, and so a better, more parenting word we might choose to use here is just consequence. That God allows the consequence of our Avon, or
iniquity,
God will allow the consequence that we've chosen to happen to us.
Right.
That biblically gets said as punishment often, and I think that's again where people get a disconnect. And so when you read punishment, sometimes maybe change that word in your mind and just say, and God will now allow a consequence from what you've chosen. Right. And so it really isn't, and this is one of those things, it isn't God who punishes. It's us. We punish ourselves by the choices we make.
Which I do love, that there are moments in Scripture where it does say that God does come in and does save us from our own. Like God does carry God, and that's God's
God
mercy.
is merciful.
God, like, so there are moments where God takes it on when God doesn't have to, and we experience grace from that. But there are times where God says,
but God is just, and sometimes that is allowing you to experience your consequence.
And so just as God is both, and so the cure, then, and again, like, hear the biblical language that's steeped in this, right? So if iniquity is behavior that's crooked or bent, then the balm, the cure, is to learn to walk upright, right? And it's not meant that it's like, oh, you have to be, have great posture and all this kind of stuff. But
I find myself trying to.
I know, right? I know.
Sit up straight, boys.
Straighter.
Come on, let's go.
Yeah, but it's meant that, like, there's no distortion, right? Like, there's no, you're not hiding anything in the midst of this anymore, right? Think of the psalmist of, my rod is straight and comforting. It's not meant as like this weapon, right? That sometimes we then think of it as it's meant to steer. There's nothing hiding in this. My path is straight. There's no curveballs coming at you. I'm telling you the way to go, right? So God's path is straight, and iniquity's path is bent and curved.
Well, and it comes back to, again, that idea that I love that you're bringing up. Like, how do we heal? How do we deal with sin? Well, again, if sin is the crookedness, especially a crooked worldview and understanding, well, then we teach. We all know somebody, and again, just say the name to yourself, whoever that is in your world. You know somebody that has a bent worldview on something, and you can hate and attack them, or you can try to help them understand that that's bent, and help them understand what does straight look like. And again, I go back to, for us as disciples of Christ, when we get bent, how do we know what is straight? How do we come back to that true straightness? Well, we look to the teaching in the example of Jesus Christ. And so that's the challenge.
And that's where you kind of partner things like iniquity and sin together, because maybe it's a thing where it's like,
you might have done more of these.
Yeah. Well, also though, it's like, it might be that, like, I'm so bent that this feels straight to me, whereas this is straight, and so I'm hitting the target more, but I'm still not in line with Jesus. But as I do this, now I can get to here, right? So it's moving closer and closer.
It can be a gradual.
It can, right?
Again, going on to perfection.
Exactly. And again, it's the same kind of way that we teach our kids. And so we've talked a lot, right? So we've kind of put into framework. Just to recap, sin, right? Sin is moving on that archer closer to the bull point, closer to being more in line with Jesus, and not like not further from what Christ has, right? Transgression is the breaking of trust, right? And so the healing for that is reconciliation. And then iniquity is the bent, and it's learning to become straight again. So like I said, next week we're going to get further into this on parenting, but just a couple of quick ways of why this is helpful for parenting. I think first and foremost is it helps us as parents identify, and just another way to understand and note the difference between identity and action for both our kids and for ourselves, right? Of that our kids can do these actions. Our kids are going to do these actions. We're going to do these actions. Right. It's not their identity, and we can help them denote that as two separate things. And the second is this: it's helpful for our kids when appropriately aged to understand that life is complex. It's not black and white. Yes, when our kids are little, sometimes we got to teach them very simple things. Yeah, exactly.
Don't touch the stove.
Don't touch the stove. Period. Like, just don't touch the stove, period, right? Like, and then as they get older, we can start to distinguish of how to identify when the stove is hot or not hot, and
here's how you can use the stove eventually.
Yeah, exactly, right? But life is complicated and it's nuanced, and it's better for us to engage in that. And if someone, as you're growing older, is trying to convince you that it's only black and white, they're selling you something.
Yep.
And so helping our kid engage in the gray of life is only going to better equip them. And being willing to engage in those hard conversations with our kids on even things like the different types of sin, even to tell our kid, like, okay, yeah, you know what? You're right. You didn't sin that was evil.
Right.
But was that really the best choice? Way?
Yeah. Was that your best choice?
Yeah.
Could you have done better?
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about.
Exactly. And then lastly, and I think this is a big one that I think is a newer topic of just like for our generation of parenting, which is, I think it can help us as parents own our own mistakes. And it can help us to remember that we're even allowed to apologize to our kids as parents. I
had to do that last night. We're driving home. It's midnight. We're driving home from the airport.
Yeah.
We've been flying. Everybody's hungry. And we're pulling in, and my kids can't agree on where we can pull in and get something to eat that everyone's willing to eat it. And I just got frustrated and kind of snapped on everybody. We finally get the food, whatever, and as we're driving about 5 miles down the road, I was like, hey, I'm sorry, everybody. I'm really tired.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get home, but you know what? I could have handled that better. My bad.
Yeah, and like sometimes it can be really playful, and sometimes, and again, I think it's just modeling for our kids how they too can, own up to their own mistakes. Right. And also, I think another piece of it is teaching them who's trustworthy in their lives, because to go back to something we said earlier, I think, Kevin, you said it earlier in the podcast, we're all human. Yep. We're all going to make mistakes. And so being able to own it when we miss the mark is huge. And being able to own it and apologize for it and articulate that and move on also gives our kids the template for how to do that back with us and to do that with other relationships.
Well, you think about who you trust, right? If I shot my arrow and you can see it not hit the mark, but I'm telling you, no, I hit a bullseye.
You're like,
right? And I think that's one of the things I love that you're bringing up, that we teach our children. Own that you didn't hit the bullseye. It's okay, because then you know how to start correcting it so that you can try to get closer next time, rather than just defending and saying, no, my arrow went exactly where I aimed it. I wanted to hit the blue. I didn't want to hit the red.
See, but, Carson did hit the bullseye.
He did. I have a picture of it.
Just so you know. I'm only saying that because I threw him under the bus earlier. So
I have a picture
you're
of
welcome.
It. I was there. I have photographic evidence.
Yeah, I do bullseye. I love the archery example, and when I don't remember when I first heard about that, but it's just that
it's really
there's
helpful.
Different levels, and that was the first time I remember that's a practical way for me to understand sin, and the difference of sin and evil. It's just a very good. It's like right away it clicked. I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
That's why we want to give it to y'all.
Sense.
That's right, exactly.
It's very helpful and very practical.
Yeah.
And so we want to offer you this because we believe that the conversation's better when you take it to your family and continue the conversation past the time of this podcast. And so we wonder, and we hope you'll have this conversation with your kids around the family table, which definition of sin maybe surprised you or piqued your interest the most. Have that conversation as a family sometime this week. And would you receive this benediction, a blessing that's meant to be lived out this week? Would you go seeking to do no harm, seeking to do good, and seeking to stay in love with God? See you next week.